So what I'm going to do, we in some previous meetings, we talked about how it might be useful if we could share a bit of experience around our experience of peer review. So this is something that we maybe do sort of every couple of months, something like that. So this is a reference to a paper that I had published in anesthesia, or we have published in anesthesia earlier on in the year, sort of at peak COVID time. So it sort of slipped slightly under the radar, but then there were more important things going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly talk about the paper, but then more than that, really talk about what happened with peer review. And it was a bit of a journey, which I think was mostly constructive. The guys who were on the WhatsApp group will have seen some of my frustrations at the latter part of last year. So some of this won't be completely new. So called it the good and the bad and the third reviewer. So there's sort of lots of stories about how the third reviewer is not necessarily particularly kind. It doesn't necessarily always hold true. Sometimes it's a different number reviewer, let's put it that way. So this is the paper that I'm going to reference. So I was one of the Neela Fellows back in a long time ago now, sort of 2013 to 2015. So this is a secondary analysis that I did with Hannah Boyd Carson, who was one of the current Neela Fellows, and a bunch of other people who I'll come back to in a minute. So what we're looking at was the association of preoperative anemia with bad outcomes after emergency laparotomy, so using the Neela data set. So this is a little bit of timeline. So we actually decided we're going to do the project something probably like 6 months before that, so middle part of 2018. At the end of 2018, we felt like we had a reasonably put together manuscript, so we submitted it to the British Journal of Surgery. It got turned down, so I think it was a bit sooner than that after that, but sort of maybe springtime 2019, we took it to the British Journal of Anaesthesia, who looked at it, gave us some feedback, peer review. Wasn't a complete no, so we resubmitted it. They didn't like what we'd done with it, so back in sort of this time last year, July 2019, we got a negative response from them. We took it to anaesthesia, went through a few iterations, and then, like I said, it published sort of towards the end of winter, the beginning of this year. So the people we had, so Anita Sugavanam is an anaesthetist from Brighton, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that, and she is the driving force behind this body of work. So there's a few things that will come out of this. You may have already heard bits and pieces, so particularly looking at, I'm just trying to get the right word, all the relevant studies in patients who are anemic before surgery, so all of the hemodynamics, that's what I was looking for. So how well they're being done, and then there'll be an RCT that will follow from this. So this was kind of, this was a retrospective look to see what practices were like and see how big a problem it was. We had a surgeon on our authorship, so that's Hannah. We had 2 hematologists, Simon Stanworth being consultant, some anaesthetists, Neela representatives, and the things to say that are also relevant. So it's my first senior authorship on a paper, so I learned a lot, some of which I'll share. And we had 2 joint first authors, which can be good, and it can cause some slight difficulties as well. So Hannah was particularly in charge of the analysis, and Akshay did most of the write-up. So yeah, it's something that you will see quite often in publications, having 2 joint first authors, but that causes some trickiness as well. So just to give you a bit of an idea of what the paper was. So this is the last line of our introduction, our aims. So what we really wanted to do was do a good drill down analysis of associations of preoperative anemia with morbidity, mortality, prolonged length of stay, some of the outcomes we were able to look at within the Neela data set. So mortality, unplanned return to theatre, that's what these things at the bottom are, and unplanned admission to ICU. One of the main things to say is that Neela doesn't collect any transfusion data. So this is a big flaw in this analysis, but you have to sort of accept limitations when you do a big piece of work. So, like I said, we went to the British Journal of Surgery first, the BJS, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through a few bits of reviewer feedback, some that were really helpful, some less helpful. And then hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion at the end, particularly if you've got experience, anybody who's listening. So we had 2 reviewers from British Journal of Surgery. So one of the things to say is that the number of reviewers varies dramatically between publication, between editorial boards and the journals. So reviewer 1 came back with, I think, what was supposed to be constructive criticism, saying there is considerable scope for us to undertake a more targeted analysis that would greatly enhance the paper. And I think really in retrospect, they were right. So some of the other things that they contributed were things that are very helpful when you can't see the wood for the trees, whether it's with a thesis or with a publication, you may miss something. So the way that our tables were formatted, our results were reported, agreement between the text and the table. So things that you can miss because you go through multiple iterations. So some useful things. Some things that we found fairly unhelpful, but actually it led us to include them in the discussion. So they said that we should also acknowledge some of the confounding factors that aren't collected. So for those of you who are familiar with looking at adjusted outcomes or multivariable analysis, you can only control for the confounders that you put in the model. And that's what this is saying, but it wasn't particularly helpful because we didn't have access to them. But having said that, we then included it in the discussion and said it would be useful to have some additional factors like albumin, might be interesting. One of the things you see coming through in these comments though is that quite often it's reviewer subjective. So things that they may feel particularly passionately about, and you'll particularly see in one of the later examples that this is true. One of the things they said that we had not explored possible reasons were underlying the bad outcomes, really. And again, those of you who are familiar with this sort of analysis, we're often very reluctant to say that things are causative. So we'll do an analysis and say having anemia is associated with worse outcomes, but we wouldn't be comfortable to say that the anemia causes the worse outcomes. But like I said, some things have been quite helpful, some are less helpful. The bit that I've highlighted here. So this reviewer's impression was that we should have excluded the kind of cases that you wouldn't expect to present with anemia. I don't know if that makes sense. So I think they say obstructive hernias and bowel obstruction. And this is a little bit, I'd suggest, of a lack of understanding of the type of analysis. So the signal should come through even despite the fact that there are few cases with anemia in these sorts of patients. So one of their suggestions was that we should take out the kind of indications for surgery that wouldn't necessarily be associated with anemia. We'll come back to that because it's an important point, but actually I think that was wrong. So reviewer 2, who signed it at the end, Rupert Pierce, was very constructive. The outcome was not great. We didn't get it wasn't accepted for publication, but actually, particularly his comments were really very helpful. And I've just cut and paste this in here because it was very clearly thought out, very structured, his responses to us. So some of the main points that Rupert suggested for us were that we better structure the manuscript. So using the strobe reporting for observational studies, we should make our introduction more compelling that the reason why we're doing the research is an important reason. Bits and pieces among the methods, most of which were just that we didn't really include enough detail to make it easy for the reader. So one of the key bits of advice that I'd suggest is that you make, if you're writing a paper or chapters for your thesis, that you make it easy for the reader. And we hadn't really done that. Pick one primary outcome. So we were looking at 30-day and 90-day because we couldn't really decide which was more important. And I'm being facetious, there's good arguments for either, that whether the anemia is associated with chronic morbidity, then 90-day mortality might be more relevant. If it's acute anemia, so acute bleeding, and potentially 30-day mortality might be more relevant. And we were in two minds, and so we had two primary outcomes. His advice was to pick one, which we did as a result of this. or reporting the results. As per the other reviewer, they weren't really detailed enough. And again, some really helpful advice. I think his suggestion was that our discussion is in 4 distinct paragraphs or 4 parts. Some journals, I think it's JAMA, you have to use this kind of format. Others, it's less didactic. So, but yeah, I think this is very helpful advice. And if you're looking to put something together, start with the structure and then you can expand from there. So that's, yeah, as I've said already, the final outcome was a rejection from the British Journal of Surgery. So reflection and our response to those reviews. So reflection, like I said, in hindsight, that paper really wasn't ready for submission, I don't think. So we took it as being very constructive. We selected a single primary outcome, like I said, 90-day mortality. We included modelling for the indication for surgery, which I'll come back to again. Expanded the covariates, so the confounding factors. Hannah had chosen to use POSM as a single number. And actually what we did is we split it into the 18 components and added the things that we thought were relevant as well. We gave better explanation for why we did things better, reporting of the methods, like I said, make it easy for the people who are reading your paper, clearer results, clearer reporting of the results. One of his comments was also that we only had 23 references, something like that, so we included some more references. So what we did, we took pretty much all of those comments on board. We substantially reworked that article. As I said, it really wasn't ready for submission, but we got some really helpful feedback. And we took our manuscript next to the British Journal of Anaesthesia. So back in June 2019, we got our first set of reviews back. And as I said, it can vary dramatically between the journals, the number of reviewers you have. So we had 2 with BJS, we had 4 reviewers this time around. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out a few points that were either helpful or unhelpful again. So for this is reviewer 1. So I'm just trying to remember this point. So they're concerned that what we hadn't done really was look at the opposite of the review from the British Journal of Surgery is the patients who are most likely to be in, so those who are having surgery to control hemorrhage. And so there were a few points around that. As I'd said earlier on, and again, this is the opposite really of one of the reviewers with the BJS. He was, sorry, they were suggesting that we shouldn't use the word impact because it implies a causative relationship. So, like I said, it's the opposite of what we were encouraged to do by the British Journal of Surgery. So, giving you a bit of an idea that this sort of thing can be quite subjective. So, steering us away from implying any causation, which is what I think most of us would agree is the sensible thing to do here. Again, some commentary about the way that we had reported our method. So, making it a bit clearer, making it a bit easier for the reader. And there were some others, but these are the ones I've sort of picked out to be particularly helpful. One of their other comments, of reviewers' comments, and this is the sort of thing I'm sure everybody who's been through peer review will have experiences like this. So the text in red there was our sort of working up a response to some of these comments. So they said that the particular way that we looked at some of modelling some of the continuous data, they made a suggestion that we should do it in a different way. And actually we've done it that way, suggesting they'd either missed it, we'd not explained it well enough, or they'd not really read the manuscript in as much detail as we would hope they might have done. So then this is one of the other reviewers. And again, this is just like I said, so it can be quite kind of subjective. So they were concerned that actually maybe we shouldn't have chosen 90-day mortality as our main outcome. Like I was saying before, we were very much in 2 minds about whether we should have 30-day or 90-day as our primary outcome. And we pumped for 90-day, and we gave some explanation of why we'd chosen 90-day. And sometimes there isn't a right answer. So so long as you give your justification for why you've picked something as a primary outcome, or perhaps the way that you've analysed your data, as long as you give the reason for it, then you've done what you need to do, really. So what we took from this was that we just hadn't really explained well enough why we'd chosen 90 days. So the next comment was, I thought was just quite an unusual one. So they wanted us to draw conclusions about malignancy that I'm not sure were really realistic to draw. So we included malignancy as one of our covariates, but they sounded like they were sort of drawing on their clinical experience, wanting us to make some leaps and some assumptions that I'm not really comfortable to do. And then the final bit down there on the bottom highlighted about propensity score analysis. So like I was saying just before, we had chosen multivariable analysis as the way that we were going to model. There are other ways of doing things, and this kind of thing I think is fairly unhelpful. So what we did, we took on board the comments and we gave a little bit further justification that the reason why we had analysed it using multivariable analysis was the way that we'd chosen to do it. But this is the kind of thing that it isn't unexpected, and so long as you can reply in commentary and slightly adjust the discussion of your manuscript and the reporting of methods, that's what you need to do. So the 4 reviewers came back with the opinion that major amendments were needed. So I take that as a positive. So it wasn't a no like we got with BJS for the first time round. It was that we needed to change things in a pretty major way, address the comments of the 4 reviewers and resubmit, which we did. I'll jump forward a little bit. So our reflection, our responses to those comments were that it was a lot better than the first draft, but there was still quite a way to go before it was really ready for publication. And that's, I mean, that's the majority of the comments of the reviewers, apart from saying whether we did things the right way, which we could defend. It's about enhancing the manuscript, and all of this process really led to a much improved manuscript. From it, we just had it accepted what we submitted to the BJS the first time around. So what we did, we addressed many of the comments, not necessarily every single one of them. There was quite a lot of deliberation amongst the authorship about how we would deal with some of these things. So the first was one of those comments that just shows you what we do with the hemorrhagic indications. So maybe it's bleeding peptic ulcer or intra-abdominal hemorrhage. And we decided not to completely separate it out, but to include it as a covariate, so try and control for it as a confounder, looking at the outcomes of interest. And the other thing that we thought long and hard about before we submitted it was how we would report some of our conclusions. So we looked at anemia using the WHO categories, so not anemic, mildly, moderately, or severely anemic. What you really want to see when you do this sort of analysis is a clear gradations. So best outcome if you're not anemic, and then it's getting sequentially worse to the severely anemic category. And we didn't see that, unfortunately. And that can be for a whole bunch of different reasons, different sizes of the group, so the significance values vary. But we didn't see this clear graduation, and we wanted to, and we thought long and hard about how we were going to report that, like I just said. So we had 2 happy reviewers, 1 moderately happy reviewer and 1 unhappy reviewer with our resubmitted draft. So we took, like I said, we took on board most of those comments. We didn't quite address all of them, and that was perhaps a downfall, but I think you need to be able to defend what you do. So there's a whole load of stuff from the different reviewers, but this is the editor's letter, and this is the heart sink moment when you open that email and you're thinking, is it going to get accepted? Is it going to be rejected? And that first line, sorry to inform you, I have to do this again. So the main concerns were the things I've just talked about. So how we reported the anemia, the graduation of the different types of anemia, the fact that we hadn't separated out the acute hemorrhage, we hadn't separated the analysis into 2 distinct groups, we just included it as a covariate. and again, the fact that we chose a 90-day mortality. So these were the things that we felt we weren't necessarily happy to compromise on, but it meant that we didn't get publication in the BJA. So that, on the second time round, after going back to them and making most of the amendments that they wanted, was a rejection. So we've been through 2 journals now, so we discussed where we thought would be the next best home for this. So like I said, we had surgeons, we had anaesthetists, we had haematologists on the authorship. So we had some different opinions, but we thought it sat most naturally with an anaesthetic audience, so we took it to anaesthesia. So in the beginning of autumn last year, we took it to them again. Our thoughts from the 2-3 previous rounds of peer review were that it had been much improved. We decided that what we were going to do was to separate out those hemorrhagic indications to have them as 2 subgroups. So do one analysis in patients who had hemorrhagic indications and one in everybody else. So we took that advice on board, perhaps too late for BJA, but we thought it probably was the right thing to do on reflection. And we took on board a lot of the other comments as well. So this is an iterative process where it was definitely improving, and we were probably learning as we went. So we've gone from having 2 reviewers with the BJS, 4 reviewers with the BJA, and with anaesthesia. What we found out, not initially, but was that we only had 1 reviewer who was one of the editorial board, who so Danny gave us the insight on this, that if the editorial board feel like they have expertise in an area, they won't put it out for peer review, they will review it themselves. And so we had 1 reviewer. So if there was some subjectivity in the previous peer review, I'd suggest there was substantial subjectivity here. So these are some of his comments. I'm not going to name, you might be able to work out who it is, and some of you know who it is anyway. So I'm not expecting you to read what's on the screen here. We've got a really, really long, I think it was sort of 4 pages of comments from the editor. And as you can see, there were lots of comments about how bad the NELA risk prediction model was. So this reviewer had more problems with the NELA risk prediction model, which we didn't use, than anything else. So yeah, we didn't use it in our analysis, but he couldn't help himself but point out all of the things that he thought were wrong with it. So I counted this last night. I think it's sort of 13 times in those 2 paragraphs he mentions how bad he thinks the NELA risk model is. I don't think that, by the way. So one of the next points that I'm going to draw out, so again, 2 more mentions about the NELA risk prediction model in yellow there. And then the bits in red are criticism, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like I said before, it can be helpful, of the way that we've modeled some of the data. So we chose to remodel some of the continuous variables. So we did quadratic equations for them. There are a variety of different ways. His suggestion was that we should have used splines and knots. Doesn't matter if you don't necessarily understand the detail, but the important thing is that there are benefits and there are advantages and disadvantages for using different approaches. This is a different approach that we didn't think was particularly better than the one we'd used. So again, this sort of feedback I think is fairly unhelpful, but what we did is we then gave some more discussion about why we had done the transformations in the way that we've done them. So the next point I've drawn out in that I've highlighted here is it's the kind of thing that makes you frustrated when you first read it, because you think we did that, but actually the reason why it comes up in peer review is obviously you've not described it well enough, and you've not you've not highlighted it enough in the text. So he was suggesting that we had categorized a lot of the continuous variables. We hadn't done, but actually what it made us realize was that we hadn't explained our methods well enough, so we adjusted that. Again, this is criticism of the way that we modeled the data. So we use multivariable analysis, like I said before. He was suggesting that we use a different type of analysis, which I'm not sure is particularly advantageous to use over what we had used. But again, it's about defending the way you've done something. And for us to have changed this would have taken months and months more. None of us really had much expertise in this. So our replies to these comments were, we've done it this way, and this is why we've done it this way. I've got a little helper come and join me. Okay, so it was finally accepted back in January on the 3rd iteration. So we replied to the comments, we made the changes that we thought were reasonable to make. And we went through 2 lots of comments with this editor, and it's finally accepted. So you can see my tweet there. I think it was a lot of effort to get it over the line. Having said that, I think that the team at Anesthesia were really helpful. I think they really wanted to publish it. They thought it was a good piece of work. It needed more modifications. It needed more improvements, just like I've been saying. It's an iterative process, which definitely improves the manuscript. So some general discussion points that I just thought I'd bring up. So I don't know if anybody wants to chip in. This is, I'm going to open this up to everybody, their experience of peer review. We can sort of take it whichever direction you want. So some of the things that I really want to highlight are that the end result is definitely enhanced from what we took to the British Journal of Surgery sort of a year, 18 months before. If you are looking to publish a chapter for your thesis, that peer review is invaluable. The subjectivity of the reviewer, so I've shown you some conflicting reviews between the journals. So you don't necessarily have to do what every reviewer wants you to do, would be what I suggest, but you need to explain why you've done what you've done. When to hold out if you think something's the right way to do it, when to toe the line and do what the reviewers suggest. So we didn't make the main amendments that the BJA wanted us, that's not right. Some of the main amendments we didn't make, and the BJA rejected it, but we thought we had done it the way that we wanted to do it. So sometimes it doesn't get you the publication where you want it to be, but you need to make that decision. Know your journal, reviewers and editors. So as I said at the beginning of this meeting, there's a lot of shared experience among the people who are on this call and in the wider group. So ask a friend. People may well have been through this with the journal that you're looking to submit to, and they can give you some useful feedback. And the final bit is, so I've had this a couple of times. So you get all the comments of the different reviewers. I'm interested to see what everybody else reads into these things. But you always get these comments from the editors, which I always assume are general, but there are all sorts of things about the way you formatted your text and the language you've used. But I can't help wonder whether they've noticed things that I haven't done quite right, and so I go back and I pick through with a fine comb trying to find these things. But I think it's probably just the general comments that go at the end of every peer review. One thing I was just going to do before I open up the discussion, if it's okay. So I've done a little bit of peer review for different journals. This is Journal of the American Cardiologists. I can't remember what the other C stands for. So this is the structure they suggest you use, and actually I've tried to use it in subsequent peer reviews. And so if you are asked to do peer review, to try and reduce the subjectivity and try and make it very constructive. So yeah, open it up. Any comments? Any questions? Anybody there?